So good evening, everyone, and welcome to what I'm sure will be a fascinating event. We're here for Inflation and Institutions, Türkiye, the United States, and the Politics of Price Stability, an event organized by Contemporary Turkish Studies at LSE. My name is Yaprak Gürsoy. I'm a professor of European politics and chair in Contemporary Turkish Studies here at the European Institute at LSE. Tonight, we have the real pleasure of welcoming Professor Selva Demiralp from Koç University in Istanbul. She's going to talk to us about recent inflation dynamics in Turkey and the United States, and particularly how political pressures and institutional credibility shape inflation expectations and policy effectiveness. Now, for those of you who follow Turkey economic policy, inflation, and financial news, Professor Selva Demiralp really needs no introduction. You have seen her insights and commentary across various Turkish media outlets and social media. But her research extends far beyond Turkey. She's a regular contributor to some of the most prestigious world's outlets, such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times, just to name a few. So she's really someone whose voice matters when we're thinking about the broader implications of economic and financial stability. As an academic, Professor Demiralp is also quite productive and has contributed extensively to research well beyond Turkey, with articles in leading economic journals. Now, I have to confess that some of these journal articles, as a political scientist, is beyond my technical expertise. But what makes Professor Demiralp particularly valuable is her remarkable talent to translate complex technical information for wider audiences. Her contributions to political economy make her someone I follow regularly, and I'm sure many of you do too. Given her expertise, it's no surprise that she also serves as the director of the Koç University TÜSİAD Economic Research Forum, that is the Turkish Business People's Association, and she also worked as a consultant for the European Central Bank. Among many of her affiliations and work, she has also engaged with both the Federal Reserve and the Central Bank of Turkey. So when she's talking today, she's probably also reflecting some of that experience. After Professor Demiralp's lecture, we are equally privileged to have Dr. Orkun Saka as our discussant. Dr. Saka is a visiting senior fellow here at the European Institute and associate professor of economics at City St. George's, University of London. For the past 5 years, Orkun Saka has been the main organizer of our LSE workshop on political economy of Turkey. With his expertise in financial intermediation, political economy, and international finance, and some really impressive academic publications, he's perfectly placed to stimulate our discussion tonight. I should also mention that tonight's event actually grew out of Dr. Saka's initial idea, based on some exciting new collaborative work he's been doing with no other than Professor Demiralp. So before we begin, I just want to go through some quick housekeeping points. First of all, I just learned that I'm required to say that there is not going to be a fire drill tonight. So if you hear the fire alarm, we will have to go out, and the meeting point is Lincoln Inn Fields, the park. Please also turn off the volume of your phones if you haven't done so already. We are recording tonight's event. This is why the microphone was so important. We are planning to make it available, the lecture and the discussion afterwards, as a podcast and as a YouTube video later on. After about 45 minutes of presentation and discussion among our speakers, we'll open the floor for questions. Please do hold your questions until then. We'll have plenty of time to have a discussion at the end. And finally, we'll have a reception afterwards, immediately after the panel outside. So please do stay and join us for further discussion. So without further ado, Professor Demiralp, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that very generous and great introduction.
Yeah, I have my microphone anyway.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm going to use slides over. Okay, thank you. So my presentation today is inspired by current economic developments, both in Turkey and in the United States. Usually, Turkish financial markets and inflation dynamics tend to behave quite different from what you see in the United States. But what we have been observing very recently is a strange convergence between the two economies, where it's not like Turkish economy is acting similar to an advanced economy, but the US economy is acting more like an emerging market economy. And in this talk, I wanted to talk about what is happening, what is common, and what is different between the two countries, and what is common and what is different in the current economic developments between the two countries. If we look at the current news, we can see the similarities more clearly. What we see, the news clip on the left is for United States. We see that the headline says, "The Fed under pressure as inflation expectations surge." When did this happen? Well, closely after President Trump's takeover, after November elections, and especially after he took over the presidency, when he signaled about the tariffs, how he's serious about the tariff policy, and after the Liberation Day on April 2nd, we have seen a gradual deterioration in inflation expectations in the United States, and that puts the Federal Reserve under pressure because as the central bank who is in charge of achieving price stability, you have to control inflation expectations. Now, the subtitle is a new survey from the University of Michigan shows consumers soaring sharply on the economic outlook. Now, the University of Michigan does a survey of consumer sentiment, and in that survey, they ask about inflation expectations as well. And the news clip on the right is this time talking about the Turkish markets. Now, if we look at the dates for United States, this is from April 11, 2025. And for the Financial Times article on the right, this is from March 25, 2025. So the dates are very close. And what we see is in two parts of the world, we see financial markets getting nervous, inflation expectations going up. If we read more clearly what the Financial Times article says about the Turkish markets, it says, Turkey seeks to calm investors after market turmoil. And the subtitle says, protesters rally for seventh night after Istanbul mayor was jailed on corruption charges. So in Turkey, just like United States, after the arrest of Istanbul mayor, but we shouldn't just say he is Istanbul mayor, he is the opposition's presidential candidate for the next elections. We have seen an increase in risk premium and a deterioration in inflation expectations. So in both countries, we see a decline in consumer confidence and a deterioration in inflation expectations. And what I want to do today is to examine the parallels between the two countries. What is common is in both countries, we have self-inflicted uncertainty driven by political tension and the consequent market response. The causes for political instability are different. Now, for once at least in Turkey, as an economist, I won't be talking about the consequences of economic policy mistakes. What is happening right now, the market stress and the tension, has nothing to do with the central bank cutting interest rates at the wrong time or the fiscal policy being overly accommodative, but it has to do with a political decision which has consequences in financial markets. The trigger in Turkey is the arrest of Istanbul mayor, like I said. The trigger in the United States is tariff-related uncertainty. It's not just the announcement of tariffs, but one day we hear the tariffs, and we hear from the policymakers and President Trump that they are there and he's never going to step back. The next day he says everything is subject to bargaining and negotiations and other things that I'm not going to elaborate, bad things, but this back and forth and the uncertainty led to a financial market response because markets don't like uncertainty. As an investor, okay, if you see that there are tariffs, this is the new normal, and if I need to produce a car in the United States, I know that I can't import the auto parts from Canada or Mexico. Then I move on. But the thing is, tomorrow there might be another postponement of tariffs, or there might be a complete abandonment of tariffs. So in that environment of uncertainty, you don't know what to do, and it kind of paralyzes the investors. So the economic dynamics, the uncertainty, and the increase in risk premium led to an increase in inflation expectations in both countries. So what is common is political tension. What is different between the two countries is the cause of political tension, yet once there is a politically triggered stress, it led to a similar consequence of increase in risk, increase in inflation expectations, and a decline in consumer sentiment and a fall in institutional credibility. What I show you here is two charts for the two countries for the last 3 months. The one on the left, once again, is for the US. The one on the right is for Turkey. And it shows you recent inflation numbers, which are the straight lines for the two countries, where the right axis on the right vertical axis is the inflation rate, and the left axis is the inflation expectations. For United States, the straight line is the inflation rate, and the bars are inflation expectations for March, April, and May. Similarly for Turkey, again, the bars are inflation expectations, and the straight line is the actual headline inflation rate. What do we observe for both countries? So for United States, it is the University of Michigan's survey of inflation expectations. For Turkey, it is Koç University's survey of household inflation expectations. What is common, as you can see, is the solid line is declining as we go from March to May in both countries, whereas the bars are going up. So even though the headline inflation is coming down in both countries, inflation expectations are going up. As an economist, that's a red flag, because for one thing, if you have a very credible central bank who can anchor inflation expectations, you shouldn't see any change in inflation expectations in the first place, because if the central bank says, even if inflation deviates up and down right now, trust me, I will keep it under control. A year from now, you're not going to see it deviating from 2%. If everybody believes in the central bank, then when you ask people what they think inflation is going to be 12 months from now, they should say 2%. When you look at the Michigan survey, you see that it is around 8 to 6%, way above the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target. So that's already something unheard of in United States, where the central bank credibility is relatively high. But when you look at Turkey, you see that the picture for United States is much optimistic, because in Turkey, the actual inflation rate is around 38%, but inflation expectations are around 60 to 70%. So clearly, the pessimism about the central bank's ability to maintain price stability is much worse. Nevertheless, in both countries, the trends, even though the levels are different, the trends are similar in the sense that even though actual inflation is coming down, inflation expectations are not coming down. If anything, they are getting worse. So why is that happening? Normally, if there's persistent deviations from the central bank's target, inflation target, that's a signal for weak central bank credibility. For a long time, in the United States, at least until, let's say, 2005 or so, inflation expectations remained very close to 2%. Gradually, especially after the pandemic, as the actual inflation rate started going up, inflation expectations started deteriorating. But after the second term of Donald Trump's presidency, we have seen further deterioration in inflation expectations. Why? Because for reasons I'm going to elaborate very soon, Donald Trump is a president, a populist president, who is not shy about criticizing the Fed publicly and pressuring the Fed about what the central bank should be doing. But in an environment where central bank credibility is weak, and therefore people don't listen to what the central bank says about the inflation target, then people adjust their expectations based on actual inflation. Your central bank might say, trust me, inflation rate is going to be 2%, but you say, no, I need to look at what the actual inflation rate is when I determine my inflation expectations. When that happens, then when actual inflation rate comes down, inflation expectations should be coming down. What you saw in the previous slide is that not only that inflation expectations are not anchored at the target, but also even though the actual inflation rate is coming down, people's expectations are going up. So that's even one level worse than inflation expectations getting weaker due to weak central bank credibility. So the question is, why is this happening? We are used to this type of behavior in Turkey, where central bank credibility is very weak, institutional independence is weak, but what is perhaps more surprising is, why is the United States acting similar to Turkey? So, like I said, both countries experienced political actions that undermined central bank independence recently. And yes, we do understand that politicians typically prefer low interest rates because the election cycles are shorter, and what you want is low interest rates, so the cost of borrowing is cheaper, you go get more loans from the banking system, and you spend more, there is more production. More production means less unemployment. Less unemployment means more votes for the current government. Yet when there is central bank independence, the central bank is not going to adjust its interest rate decisions based on political cycles. Even though there might be elections next month, the central bank might say, well, if inflation pressures, inflation dynamics don't permit, I am not going to cut interest rates just so you can get elected. But if there is pressure on the central bank and the central bank cannot adjust interest rates independently, then that might lead to a dovish central bank that gives into political pressures, and as a result, inflation can get out of control, or inflation can lose its anchor. So, to the extent that you have a strong man who is pressuring the central bank to keep interest rates in accordance with an election cycle, keep interest rates low. And if the markets are aware of that, then we see inflation expectations deteriorating, because you know that your central bank won't be able to fight for price stability and achieve inflation targeting. So looking at the recent events for the last 3 months, why did we see Turkish inflation expectations deteriorating? Well, the event is the arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu and the associates on March 19, which led to a massive public reaction. And on the right, you see the protests. There has been rallies. There are still rallies in Turkey. But from the market's perspective, if we leave the political discussion aside, The arrest led to a risk premium measured by credit default swaps spiking from 250 basis points to 370 basis points. Nowadays, it stabilized to around 300 basis points, but it is still above the levels before his arrest. When this happened, when we have seen this financial market turmoil, the central bank had to intervene in order to calm down the markets. What they did first was to increase the policy rate by 200 basis points within 24 hours. On March 20th, we have seen an emergency meeting by the central bank, hiking interest rates by 200 basis points. And then another regular meeting. At that point, they increased interest rates by another 350 basis points. And easy to say, but close to $60 billion of international reserves were sold because in Turkey, whenever there is financial stress, people's instinct is to hold on to foreign exchange denominated assets, and demand for Turkish lira denominated assets go down. But when you dump Turkish lira denominated assets and try to increase your demand for dollars, it leads to a depreciation of the Turkish lira. But when that happens, because Turkey is a country that imports intermediate goods, if the central bank doesn't intervene and lets Turkish lira depreciate, that's going to be another wave of inflation. So the central bank has to control the exchange rate as well. As a result, the central bank, in order to meet demand for dollars, and that shows you the extent of the crisis, $60 billion were sold in a matter of 1 month. That picture shows you. So what do we see here? So this shows the picture since 2024. The central bank had been gradually accumulating its reserves. The blue bars are the net reserves, and the green line is the gross reserves. Technical differences, let's not get into too much technical detail, but I guess what this graph shows you is that when I say $60 billion, it's really a lot of money. It has been accumulated little by little for a long period of time, but the sharp decline in the green line that you see shows you the severity of the crisis and how the central bank had to get rid of everything it had accumulated for a long time period. In addition to selling $60 billion of international reserves, the central bank had to increase interest rates because what you're trying to do is make Turkish lira assets more attractive again. But if there is more risk associated with Turkish lira denominated assets, what you have to do is risk-free return has to go up. So if for political reasons Turkish assets become riskier, then you have to provide more compensation to make Turkish lira assets more appealing. What you see here is the interest rate determined by the central bank, what we call policy rate. I wanted to show you a little bit of history, just so you can see what has been going on in Turkish markets. So this is an experiment after September 2021. The government said, okay, we are going to cut interest rates, and at the same time, we are going to lower inflation. This is a new hypothesis that we are going to try. Central bank gradually cut interest rates. The inflation rate was around 20%. With the gradual cuts, inflation rate, I mean, if you have taken Econ 101, you know that when you cut interest rate, it's more accommodative, demand goes up, inflation goes up. So rate cuts don't tend to lower inflation, and Turkey, by deviating from orthodox policies and saying that we're going to try something else, actually proved orthodox policies, that if you cut rates, inflation rate is going to go up. So when that experiment was over, inflation rate, which was 20% around September 2021, increased to 75% by the time we came here. Then we had general elections in May 2023. the central bank abandoned the experimental policies and we switched to orthodox policies. To control inflation, we have seen successive rate hikes. That was the bitter medicine period. You see how sharply they had to increase interest rates. And when İmamoğlu was arrested, the easing cycle had begun, because you can imagine the private sector, the real side, being subject to enormous pressure when the cost of borrowing increased substantially. So in order to ease out the pressures on the real side of the economy, they had started cutting interest rates. This is just a blown up version. What we observe here is that when İmamoğlu's arrest came on March 19, the central bank first increased the rates over here, then another rate hike came over here. So at the moment, we are still above the level before the start of the arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu. Okay, so what we observe is the economic costs of political crisis. The political crisis made our central bank to tighten again in the middle of an easing cycle, sell $60 billion of reserves that they had accumulated through the tighter policies. In the United States, for different reasons, the tariff policies and the consequent market response led to similar financial stress. Inflation expectations go up again, but unlike the response in Turkey, where in Turkey, when the arrest of İmamoğlu led to financial stress, central bank had to dump all its tools in order to calm down the markets. Whereas in the United States, even though the market response was similar, as you have seen, inflation expectations went up substantially, Federal Reserve didn't do what Turkish Central Bank did. The Federal Reserve said, I'm here. If I need to intervene, I am going to intervene, but I'm not doing anything right now. My emphasis here is that the difference has to do with central bank credibility. When you have stronger institutions, like in the Federal Reserve, the central bank can say, well, if I have to, I have the tools necessary, but right now I'm not going to respond, and if you trust me, inflation will come down. Whereas in Turkey, where central bank credibility is weaker, nobody takes central bank's word for given, so the central bank has to act without promising that things are going to get better. Yes, so this is something that is called open mouth operations, coming from 1990s, Guthrie and Wright. So a credible central bank, by just opening its mouth and saying that I am here, can calm down the markets, whereas a central bank which has weaker credibility has to do open market operations as opposed to open mouth operations. I don't have time, but we have actually done research where from 2010 to 2020, we have collected political commentaries by populist leaders and looked at the response of markets and response of central bank. And what we have shown there was, even though Donald Trump pressures the Federal Reserve, just like Erdogan pressures Turkish central bank, markets disregard what Donald Trump says, whereas in Turkey, markets act on what Erdogan has to say. That was the study from 2010 to 2020, so first Trump presidency. So back then, the markets didn't even blink when Trump was bashing the Federal Reserve. But what we have seen since March is that it looks like American financial markets also started to react to what Trump has to say, maybe because the markets now think at the second term of presidency, Trump might have power over the Federal Reserve, so the Federal Reserve might act just like Turkish central bank acts, that when the president says cut interest rates, the central bank might need to do that. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to skip those. The takeaways that I would like to leave with you is political pressures over central banks do weaken central bank credibility, which is a major challenge for implementation of monetary policy. And in an environment where central bank credibility is weak, inflation expectations are not anchored. And when you study inflation expectations more closely in those environments, you might see interesting patterns. At Koç University, we started measuring inflation expectations for a while, and you can observe the survey from our website. This is also something that I'm quite proud of, because when we first started last year, there was no regular survey of household expectations in Turkey. So we are actually one of the first ones to track inflation expectations. And by observing the microdata, we can see interesting patterns. Now, Orkun is one of those people who are on our advisory board, and we are together looking at the data and looking at the patterns of inflation expectations. So I'm going to now leave the floor to him, and he can tell more about the patterns.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Is it okay? Hello? Okay, it's better. Okay, thank you very much, first of all, to Yaprak Hoca for agreeing with me to make this event a reality. As she mentioned, Selva and I were working on this new survey that she kind of came up with last year. Rightly so, and the reasons of which I'm going to also get into in my short presentation. So she talked a lot about how political institutions matter when it comes to central bank independence and managing the inflation in general, right? So I'm going to talk about a different type of institution, but still quite an important one, which is the role of the media. Okay, so my talk is going to be more complementing rather than really discussing what she had to say, most of which I already agree with. So for those of you who are not very familiar with what has been going on in Turkey, I want to kind of widen the time frame a bit, right? So that you can see how Turkey was kind of struggling with inflation for a while and what the central bank was doing. So you see here two different types of patterns. So the line itself is the rate of inflation as measured by the official statistics in Turkey, which is the Turkish Statistical Institute. And the bars that you're seeing is the benchmark interest rate decided by the central bank, right? So up until 2018, things seem to be kind of fine. But then in the summer, for those of you who are Turkish or may remember what happened in the summer of 2018, we had a period where the Turkish lira lost value, right? A depreciation period, which led to obviously some imported inflation into the country. What the central bank did as a response is what any kind of, let's say, rational central bank would do, which is starting to increase the benchmark interest rate, right? So and what you see is that inflation starts kind of gradually going down, right? And then for those of you who might remember also, a couple of years later, around 2021, we had a similar period with depreciation, and then inflation started again showing its face. And the central bank first started with the same rational response of increasing the interest rates. But then those of you who might also remember, towards the second half of the 2021, we had a turnover in the governorship of the central bank, right? So it was someone who was from a government-friendly newspaper, let's put it that way, a columnist who was replaced, who was arguing that actually we need lower interest rates to fight the inflation. Right? So basically the president agreed with that kind of policy directive and then put the new central bank governor into place. And what we see afterwards is the economic experiment that Selva just mentioned, right? So what we're seeing here is that actually the central bank is lowering the interest rates and you see the inflation is kind of skyrocketing, right? So that just I guess there is no better proof than this, that that was a very wrong policy at the time. And then towards 2023, what we are seeing is that actually somewhat magically, the official inflation figure starts going down, right? And for some reason, also around the same time, we have lots of public discussion about whether this inflation figure is right. Many people complaining that their inflation figures in their own lives are very, very different. Some economists are coming up with alternative indices, right, measuring the inflation through like online price, etc. ENAC is one such group that tries to find some alternative proxy to see whether that is matching the official statistics, and it doesn't really around that time. It shows 3 times more, sometimes 4 times more inflation figures compared to the what the Turkish Statistical Institute was arguing for. And what we have around actually this is after the local elections in 2024 is the replacement of the economic team, the entire economic team in the country, and president deciding that, okay, after kind of a year and a half, maybe more of this kind of failed experiment, let's go back to the orthodoxy, right? So that's where we are now. And what we see here, first, there is some correction in the official inflation rate. So if you can think of this inflation rate, if you believe in the official statistics, as going down and then going up, or you may think of it as like slowly going down probably, and this part is probably something, kind of underestimated within that period, right? So this is where we are. We have the melting of the independence of the central bank, right, which destroys any kind of communication effort, because in the background, financial markets are very well aware for quite some time now, right? It's not just the last couple of years. For quite some time now, it's the president who makes the decisions, right? So whoever you put on the front of the office, it doesn't seem like it's coming out as very credible. Even as late as November 2024, we see the president arguing that the previous policy was the right one. So why is this the problem? The lack of credibility, because then this brings low trust both in the institutions, but also in the publicly available information that's coming from the government, right? And that's going to create heterogeneity in inflation expectations, of course, right? People don't know where to look at, right? One of the important roles of having a credible data source is that people can coordinate on that source. People can say, oh, yeah, the inflation seems to be, let's say, 30%. Okay, then maybe I should adjust my, let's say, rent contract according to that. If I don't believe in that 30%, there can be many other factors that will kind of, contribute to my decision of what to expect, and it's going to include like my personal experiences, right? Including like, what's going on in the market that I shop for. It's going to include ideology is going to start, kicking into my economic expectations, and the media, what I hear from the media, right, is going to be very important again. And here is the survey that Salwa mentioned, which is the recent survey that started in 2024. Here, what we are seeing is the first year of the survey and the average inflation expectations, right? So this is, on average, what we are seeing is a bit of a rise after the local elections, and then a gradual decline, okay? But remember, this is just the average. This is what it looks like when you divide people in that survey by the type of party that they are voting for, okay? So you see the orange one is the government party, right? And the black one is the main opposition party, right? So to me, it looks like the main opposition party kind of creates this upper boundary in terms of inflation expectations, right? They're really expecting high inflation, and they consistently expect that high inflation, right? It seems that they're not changing it much, right, over the sample period. And the opposite holds for the government party, right? So they are expecting lower inflation, relatively lower inflation, right? And also they are kind of, determined in that they're not changing it much. But other parties in between, right, they seem to have much more variation in terms of, what they expect, and it seems to change. So why does this matter? It matters because when we have a political aspect that kind of starts playing into economic expectations, it really matters which channel you watch. It matters which party you vote for, right? And here is kind of just an excerpt of one of the kind of studies that we are looking into these days with Salwa, where we categorize different channels in Turkey based on their political affiliations, right? And we asked this, we didn't decide on this, we asked this on to two different LLM platforms, ChatGPT and DeepSeek, and they categorized the channels into 3 groups, right? So the first group, the orange one, is the government-friendly channels. The blue one is the neutral, relatively neutral channels, and the black one is kind of on the opposition side, right? Critical channels. And with that grouping in mind, if you look at how people are choosing their channels based on also who they vote for, you see this very stark polarization, right? In terms of which channels we are watching in Turkey, right? You see, perfect. So you see, for instance, you see the government party voters are 70% of the time, or 70% of those voters are watching only government supporting channels, right? And on the opposition side, the picture is almost identically same, right? If you're voting for any other party, you are also watching the opposition TV channels 70% of the time, more or less, right? And very few people in the middle, right? Those neutral channels are being watched by very few people. So this is showing this stark, polarization in the country in terms of what we are watching and how that's aligned with what we believe in terms of, political ideology or, who we vote for. Why is this important? Because media brings different narratives into our economic expectations, right? So for instance, here I'm showing some example from print media where one of those depreciation episodes, 2018, is pictured on the same day with different newspapers, right? So those newspapers that are on the left side, more kind of government-friendly ones, you see that, this is a war against us, this, depreciation attack or devaluation attack in the country. So we need to fight this, right? This is external forces attacking us, right? That kind of narrative is kind of coming across from the first page. When you look at the opposition channels, they're saying something kind of completely different, right? They're saying that this is the bankruptcy of an economic model, right? So it's the same event, but completely different types of framing of it. And that creates, if people are watching or like, let's say, reading either one of these channels, that's going to create a different parallel universe, right? Depending on which newspaper you're reading. So here, what I do is basically, for the same survey, we now divide not by who you are voting for, but also on top of that, which channel, what type of channel you are watching, right? Again, a similar pattern is arising. As you can see, the solid orange line is showing the government supporters and also watching government-friendly TV channels. They have the lowest expectations, right? So they are the lower bound, okay? And if you look on the opposite side, if you look for, voters who are other than the government party and they're watching opposition channels, they constitute the upper boundary, right? So it looks like, and other people are kind of in the middle, there's more variation in other types of people who are either voting for government but watching a different channel and the other way around, right? So it looks like when you're polarized in terms of the channel that you're watching, in terms of the party that you are voting for, then you really observe the same economy as if it's completely different, right? And that's a problem, right? And is this problem different in US? Well, it's not, right? It's not, especially given that recently many academic papers are paying attention to this and showing us that US is becoming also very polarized, and this is being reflected in its own media, even when it comes to the financial news, right? So this is a very recent paper by one of my colleagues, Nandini Gupta, and co-authors, and they're looking at the two main sources of financial information in US, New York Times and Wall Street Journal, and they're looking at the same objective information, how often this information is being repeated in those newspapers, okay? And this information is basically how often a company is having a positive stock return, okay? And it looks like when a company is more of a Republican donor, it looks like that party is being mentioned more by Wall Street Journal, and when it's a Democratic donor, relatively, it's mentioned more by the New York Times, right? So again, you're seeing that, even American media, print media, those that you might probably expect to be most sophisticated or, open-minded maybe, but still kind of ideologically laying on the different sides of the spectrum, they are showing what we would see with the Turkish media as well, right? And similar kind of patterns also hold if you look at, how they mention those news in terms of positivity and negativity. So to conclude, basically, I'm going to say that inflation expectations are increasingly becoming an ideological, a political phenomena, in both countries, and media has a role in kind of aggravating the situation. You may ask, I think we can discuss this more in the Q&A, whether social media helps. Well, it has its own positives and negatives when it comes to social media that we can discuss further in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. So while everybody gathers their thoughts for the questions, I'm going to turn to Sayva Demiralp once again, and we'll ask whether you want to add anything to what Orkun has mentioned. Yeah.
Yes, Orkun left at the perfect spot. So one thing I can add is, during my talk, I was talking about the convergence of the two countries, Turkey and the United States. Well, political polarization has been in both countries for a while, but what is actually quite interesting right now from my perspective is how it's affecting inflation expectations, particularly in the United States. University of Michigan survey also distinguishes between the expectations of Democrats versus Republicans. And what you observe is that if you plot them over time, when Biden was in power, inflation expectations of Democrats were lower than inflation expectations of Republicans. But when Trump wins the elections, this time inflation expectations of Democrats start going up, inflation expectations of Republicans start coming down. So clearly, they kind of think that the central bank is their central bank. So if I have a Democrat president, I am proud of my central bank, and I think that the central bank is going to lower inflation. But if you're a Republican, you say, okay, it's them, it's their central bank, and they are not going to do a good job. Whereas if there is central bank independence, I mean, that's the whole idea of central bank independence. The central bank should be above politics, and it shouldn't matter whether the president is a Democrat or a Republican. Your expectations should be around 2%. So it's just yet another example of how United States is acting more like Turkey, that the public doesn't quite believe in the central bank's independence, and your political alignment is shaping your inflation expectations. To me, that's a concern, because if central bank independence is starting to be questioned, then it becomes harder to anchor inflation expectations, and then it becomes harder to achieve price stability. So it should be a warning sign. Turkish experience should be a signal for the rest of the world that central bank independence is something that we have to protect and hold on to, because once you let go of it, it becomes very difficult to reverse that cycle and achieve price stability. If you have to, then you have to really use all your tools. Like I said, sell your reserves, increase interest rates, but it has a cost on the economy. So you no longer have the power of open mouth operations at that stage.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And if you've enjoyed this event, which I'm sure you have, as much as I have, please follow Contemporary Turkish Studies at LSE. We're on social media on various channels, and I would like to thank Dr. Arzu Kırcal-Şahin for managing our social media accounts and many other things at the same time. So we are on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky now. And please do visit our website as well for more events like this. And speaking of upcoming events, we have something very special this Saturday in 2 days. We are collaborating with the British Association of Turkish Area Studies, BATAS, for an all-day symposium. We'll have 8 speakers discussing foreign policy, experiences of displacement and diaspora, and covering not only politics and policy, but also film and art. You can register for that event through our website under upcoming events. Let me close by thanking Professor Demiralp and Dr. Sako for being with us tonight and for taking the time out of their very busy schedules and while traveling between Turkey and the US. It really has been wonderful listening to both of you, and thank you all for coming, and please now proceed to the reception for further discussions.